But I'm Allison Vick. I'm the curator and program coordinator for the Tennessee Holocaust Commission. And it is my extreme pleasure to welcome Ms. Rodi Glass to tonight's webinar and to thank everybody for joining us. And I'm going to turn over to my friend and colleague, John Brown at Roane State, and later Amanda Carwell-Coxon from Pellissippi State Community College here in Tennessee. Thank you both. And I'm going to let John take it away.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody who has shown up to hear this important lecture. And it is my honor to introduce Miss Rodi Waterman Glass. She was born into a large family in Amsterdam in 1936. When she was 4 years old, Germany invaded the Netherlands, burning Rotterdam to the ground, and then marching into other cities, including Amsterdam. Life changed after that. All Jews in the Netherlands had to register their names and addresses. Germans then started issuing series of rules and laws, including curfews and restricting Jews' ability to have money and other valuables to attend school or to be in public places at all. In September of 1942, the Dutch police came to Rodi's home late at night and told her family they needed to leave. As they were loaded into a truck and taken to Central Station in Amsterdam, where they were put on a train to Westerbork Transit Camp. And I will let Ms. Rodi Waterman Glass take over from here.
I thought you were going to tell my whole story, John. So I don't know if my audience has any knowledge of how this war started. So I'll just give you a short synopsis of that. Germany lost the First World War, and the Netherlands, where I was born, was not involved in the First World War. They were neutral. And so we were when Germany started all their atrocious actions, they really had like two wars in World War II. Hitler wanted space for his the German people to spread out and to live all over the place, and he also wanted to get rid of the undesirables. It was his choice of undesirables, not anybody else's, him and his henchmen. And it started in Germany. He became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And that's when things got worse because he formed a government, and his government, his advisors, so to speak, were mostly all PhDs. Hitler was not a PhD. I don't even know if he was educated. And Adolf Eichmann, who was on his panel, was also not a PhD, but the others like Goebbels and Himmler and Rommel and all these people were all educated people. So you wonder how they made the decisions that they made. So in 1938, there was trouble all along a little bit, but in 1938, the Germans had what they called Kristallnacht, a night of broken glass. And the brown shirts burnt all the synagogues, the books, the Bibles, the Torahs, and they also destroyed the stores that were owned by Jews. Then they took some of the men, the Jewish men, and sent them to concentration camp, and it was Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a camp that Hitler put together for people who were not in the same political alliance with him, people who were against the Nazi uh, regime, and they were sent to Buchenwald. But they were not Jewish, and then on Kristallnacht they sent the Jewish men there. When the Jewish men finally some they got out of the prison camp, maybe because they had money or whatever reason. And now they know that it's time for them to get out of Germany because Hitler also declared that the German Jews were now declared Jewish, but not German. In other words, they were stateless. It's like telling you that you are whatever your religion is, but you're not an American citizen. You're only recognized by your religion. So the Jewish people were looking for places to flee to get out of Dodge. And one of the places they were able to go, not a lot, but some, Holland, the Netherlands, gave out some visas. Some people went to Shanghai through consuls who illegally gave out visas from their countries, like Sousa Mendez and people, Sukahara from Japan, China, and Sousa Mendez from Portugal, and there were many more, Harry Bingham from the United States, and gave people visas so they get out. So the German people that decided to come to Holland got there, but Holland is a small country and it's an agricultural country. And the cities, Amsterdam was the capital, Rotterdam was the biggest harbor city and still is there. And but there was not enough living space for people. They couldn't find housing or anything. So then the Dutch government said, okay, well, there is an area in the east of Holland, it's really almost near the German border, that nobody lives in because the soil is so bad you can't grow anything or do anything. So they decided that with the help of the Jewish citizens, residents in Holland, they would contribute money so they could build cabins for the German Jewish refugees that came to the Netherlands. And that place was called Westerbork. And a lot of these German refugees were regular people, but a good amount were professionals. They were doctors, lawyers, cabaret performers, poets. They were very well educated people. And they made Westerbork into a town, a little village for themselves, with the help, as I said, of Dutch Jewish money. And they had a hospital, they had sports, they had theater, and that's where they were. And this was started in 1938. Hitler was fighting all of Europe, and in September of 1939, he invaded and won for himself Poland. And that is really the official start of World War II. And after uh, after that, he just kept spreading out and fighting every country. He wanted Russia, he wanted England. Well, they had the Blitzkrieg, of course, that didn't happen. But in 1940, in May of 1940, he managed to invade the Netherlands. And it's a small country. The Queen, the royal household, knew what was coming, so they fled to England. They thought they'd be safe there. And the parliament left, and they let the country be guided by the police, the Dutch police. So that's a little bit of the background. My family are two families. My mother's family, she's one of six children, or was. And I knew my grandparents for many years. They're buried in the United States. And Well, my grandparents got married in the early 1900s in Amsterdam. They were very young. And in those days, there was a lot of poverty in the Jewish lives, and they always had a lot of children. So the children only had eighth grade education and then had to learn a trade. So my grandfather was apprenticed at a shoemaker. He became a shoemaker. My grandmother became a dressmaker. And they got married, in as I said, maybe 1923 or something like that. And on my father's side, they all lived in Amsterdam, and we're Dutch from 50, what I could establish on Ancestry. We were there from at least 1500 when it was the Inquisition with Ferdinand and Isabel, and they chased all the Jews out of Spain and Portugal. And it so happens that my grandmother had Portuguese ancestry. And by the way, when the Portuguese Jews came to Amsterdam with their money and valuables, they made Amsterdam the beautiful city it is today. It wasn't so great when they got there. And so that's just a little tidbit on the side. My father's family, he was one of seven siblings. He was a twin. He had a twin brother, and he had a lot of sisters and other brothers. And in 1940, when the Germans occupied the Netherlands, my cousins on that side were married and had children. On my mother's side, I was the only child. I was born in 1936. But back to my grandparents. When my grandparents were young and married, and my grandfather, I'm telling you, they only went to sixth grade, but he had a special brain, I think, according to me. And he said to his wife, to his young wife, he said, I don't think I want to always be working for somebody. I would like to start my own business. Well, that's all well and good, but he didn't have a penny to his name. He was, living from, let's say, paycheck to paycheck. So somehow or other, he managed to borrow some money from somebody that I don't know of. And he was going to open up a shoemaker supply store in Amsterdam. But somebody else said to him, Sam, his name was Samuel Kaiser, he said, Sam, the Dutch money, the economic situation in Holland is so bad, they're going to have an inflation or a depression. If I were you, I would not take that money and establish a business there because you're going to lose it all and it isn't even your money. And my grandfather listened to this, whoever gave the advice. And then somebody else said to him, why don't you move to London, England? You can do better there. So in 1905, the baby was born. They had a 3-month-old baby girl, my oldest aunt, and my grandparents got on a boat for England. Now remember, things weren't like they are now in transportation. You couldn't just take a plane or whatever, and they had to get on a boat. They didn't speak the language. They didn't speak English, but they went, and I thought that's very courageous. There's no the families, aunts and uncles and parents and everything, and sisters and brothers of my grandparents were still in Amsterdam, and there was no telephones or communication between England and Holland. So it was quite courageous for them to move to England, and there he worked also for a shoemaker, and eventually saved some money and opened up his own business. They also had 5 more children, of which my mother was the first one born in England. The first child was born in Holland. My mother was the first one born in London. And time marches on, and finally, as I said, there was no telephones, no communication. It was difficult to travel. So in 1923, no, not 19, well, I don't know what year it was, when my mother was 16 years old, my grandfather had accumulated some money and he went back to Amsterdam and bought a building to open a store in Amsterdam and live upstairs. And he moved the whole family back to Amsterdam. And the two oldest daughters worked in the store, and they never went to school in Holland, and they learned Dutch, through the parents, and they they were there. And so Holland at the time was very good for Jewish people to be because there was no obvious anti-Semitism. They were not restricted to what they could do in business. They were free people, like all of us are here. So everything was fine and dandy. And then my oldest aunt met a young man who she married, and he had a twin brother who married my mother, my aunt. So there were two sisters married to two brothers, which made the Waterman family very close together. They were always very close and good friends and good family. So I'm sure that everybody knew there was trouble in Germany and that Hitler, there was a Hitler. And before you know it, 1940, Hitler occupies Rotterdam and burned it down. It was the biggest harbor city, and they burned it down during the fighting because the Dutch army was not very strong or powerful. And then they came and marched into Amsterdam. And we were told, all the residents, not only Jewish, were told to put their blackout shades, we had to have blackout shades, down, and they weren't allowed to look out when the Germans marched in. So I was 4 years old. I was with my family, my mother, father, my aunts, grandparents, uncles. And we were standing in the store and peeked out the side of the window and saw the Germans march in, and I can still hear the goose stepping, the boots making the marching sound. And that was the beginning of the change for us. The Germans said they told the Dutch government, whoever was governing, there wasn't Dutch government, the police, oh, they were not here to do any harm. All they wanted was land for people to live. And after all, we're all from Germanic background and blah, blah, blah. But of course, that wasn't true. And as I said, Hitler had decided to wage war for land, and the other part of the war that he fought was to get rid of undesirables. Undesirables, according to him and his henchmen, were the Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual people, sick people in health have health physical health problems, and that were in sanitariums, with tuberculosis or stuff like that, and also people who were not all good in their head, mental health people. And he didn't like orphans either. So he started picking on all that, and the Germans formed a Dutch Jewish committee called the Joodse that was led by so-called prominent people, but they were all Jewish on the Jewish committee. They were doctors, lawyers, head of the bank, head of the diamond industry. The diamond industry was big in Amsterdam. And all the Jews from the whole country had to go to this Jewish committee and had to have identity papers made. And it had your picture on it, and it had a big J in it for Jew, because the word for Jew in Dutch is Jood, which also starts with a J. And you always had to have it with you because now the Germans occupied the country. So if you were walking down the street, they were there with their guns and could stop you at any time, Jewish or not, for your identity papers. Of course, the non-Jews didn't have to go for identity papers. Then the other rules that started coming fast and furious were that the Jews had to hand in all their valuables, like extra money or gold, silver, diamonds, whatever. Forgive me. You know, they had to hand in to the Germans, and then the Germans shipped that to Germany. Then the other rules came that Jewish children were not allowed to attend school. Jewish people were not allowed to work for non-Jewish people, and non-Jewish people were not allowed to work for Jews. Jews could not go on the streetcar, and they took away their bikes. And to this day in Holland, the bikes are the main mode of transportation. So this is all against the Jews. And eventually in 42, we all had to wear a Jewish star. And we got ration coupons. We couldn't just buy food openly. You had to have a ration coupon for butter, for bread, for milk, for everything. And even for textiles, for clothing, or I mean it was all arranged according to what the Germans wanted to do. Now the ration coupon, most of this was against the Jews. It was not against the non-Jews. And as the war broke out, when the war broke out, all of a sudden, a lot of the non-Jews formed a party, a Dutch Nazi party. So they were as bad as the Germans because all of a sudden, from a country where you didn't notice a lot of anti-Semitism, all of a sudden it came out of the ground like weeds. And not all, but a lot of the non-Jewish people were very happy that they weren't treating us so well. Now, my grandfather at that time, on my mother's side, had 3 buildings, 2 stores, and one like a storage where he kept his merchandise that was not in the other stores. And we lived upstairs from that, the warehouse. My grandmother did all the cooking because all the children some were too young, but the ones who were old enough had to work in the store. So in September of 1942, my parents had taken me across the street to put me to bed, and they were sitting relaxing in a chair with their clothes on that they worked in, and there was a loud banging on the door and dogs barking, so they knew it was not a friendly visitor. They knew it was the Gestapo. So my mother ran downstairs and said to the German that she had a child sleeping, could they come back another time? And of course, they laughed at her and said no. So they got me up, got me dressed, and we were all put on an army truck on the train in Central Station to Westerbork, because by then the Germans had found out that there was a Westerbork and there was more space there. So they built barracks and made next to the refugee camp, they made a prison camp, a concentration camp. And we were sent there on the train. We got out about 6 kilometers before Westerbork because the railroad tracks didn't go that far. And we had to walk in the nighttime with the guns, aimed at us in the mud and stuff. And I was 6 years old. I didn't know what was exactly going on because I was walking and my mother and father were holding my hand. When we got to the camp, they registered us, and my father was separated from us in the men's camp, and my mother and I were in the women's camp. So the barracks consisted of one light bulb, 150 people. They made bed like bunks, like 3 stories high. They weren't beds, they were like metal structures with wood bottoms and no mattress, no blankets, no anything. And we had nothing with us because we were just taken out of the house as is. And then they put my parents to work, and I was just hanging around as a child. And I heard my mother say to me, "Do not go near the barbed wire, because if you did, they would shoot you and would think you were trying to escape, even as a child." And by the way, the watchtowers in Westerbork that were, always watching for people escaping were not manned by Germans. It was manned by Dutch police. Shame on them. Anyway, so after a few weeks that we were there, we had very little food. It's a horrible situation to be in. It's very hard to describe, and the fear you have as an adult. So every day we had to go to a Pauplatz, which was an open space, and they put all the prisoners in there and they counted them and counted them. They wanted to make sure nobody escaped. So until they got the right count, we had to stand there no matter what the weather. And one day, we were told, we were never told nicely, we were barked at, and we were made to feel inhuman. And they said we had to go back to the Appellplatz, and my parents and I were in line, and there was tables there with German officers behind the table. And people really didn't know what was going on. And as they were walking by the table slowly, my mother recognizes one of the Gestapo men, officers, a young man who happened to live on the same street that we were at in Amsterdam. His mother was German, his father was Dutch, and he decided to join the Nazi party because you know what he loved? He was my uncle's friend. They played chess together, and he hung out at my grandmother's house because it was good food and it was always people and fun. So maybe he thought by joining the Nazi part, the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht, that he would be very important or rich, or I don't know what his object was, but he was not one of us anymore. So as my parents approached him, he recognized them, of course, and he gave my mother a sign with his eyes that she should not show that she knew him. So my parents did not. And when we got to our name, he took his list and he took our name off the list. If he had not done so, I would not be sitting here talking to you, because I would have gone on the trains to Auschwitz and Sobibor and would be dead the next day or two, because we didn't know, nobody knew that they were gassing people or killing people, but that's what happened. So we were very lucky. So now we were sent back to the barracks. And in the meantime, in Amsterdam, my uncle, who was former friend of this Nazi, was walking down the street, also in 1942, and a woman said to him, we were quite well known because of the businesses and everything, and she came up to my uncle and said, there's a guy who is in cahoots with the Germans, and he'll sell you a Speer, a paper that'll prevent you from going east. We knew we were being transported east, but they told us, they being the Nazis, that it was just for hard work. So everybody said, so we'll work hard and we'll come back. Nobody came back. It was a lie, but anyway, so she said, he'll sell you a Speer. It's called a Speer. So my uncle said, well, I don't know. He wasn't even 20 years old. He says, I don't know. I have to go home and talk to my dad. So he goes home and then he says, my grandfather says, so how much are these things? So he said it's 120,000 guilders a piece. 120,000 guilders is like $120,000. Now they use euros, but then they use guilders. So my grandfather said, well, we have 11 people. That goes into a million or more. And my uncle said to his father, well, you don't have the money. Remember, we had to hand everything in. And that point, my grandfather said, I gave them some, but I did not give them anything, everything, rather. He said he had friends in the south of Holland who did the leather tanning for our stores, and they were not Jewish, and they were his good friends. And he gave them most of his diamonds and money that he had. So he called them because they had telephones because they were in business, and they returned the money. And my grandfather gave all this money to this man. Now just think about it. He didn't know the man. He didn't know if the guy was going to do it, if he was legit. He could have turned us into the Germans. We would have been, for not handing in all the valuables, they would have shot our whole family to death or executed somehow. Or he could have kept the money for himself, or he could have done the right thing. And as luck would have it, we all got a spare. And we were still in Westerbork, and when they got it, and they somehow my grandfather got it sent to Westerbork, and we were let out of the camp back to Amsterdam. Now the Germans are taking over all the Jewish stores and putting in Dutch Nazis to handle it, or German soldiers. But the German soldiers couldn't be in those businesses very long because they had to fight in the front. So the Dutch Nazi Party helped them out very well. So in the spring of 43, we were picked up again, arrested, and sent to Westerbork again. Same terrible situation. Same. We all lived in fear anyway. Not I, because I was a child, but the adults and everybody lived in fear because they never knew what was coming next. So again, the Speer got us out of Westerbork, and we went back. By that time, there weren't many Jews left in Holland. So the Germans are very, known for their efficiency. So they had all the Jews in the rest of the country they could find all moved to Amsterdam, and we had to all move out of our homes, and they put us in an area of Amsterdam that was empty because there was a Jewish area and the Jews were already gone, not knowing that they were already dead. And we had to move into their places. And it was, I mean, it's hard to describe the fear that you live in and the uncertainty and everything. And so in September of 43, they didn't have many, couldn't find too many of Jews anymore because a lot of them had gone into hiding with righteous Gentiles and stuff like that. So, but we didn't. And in September of 43, they told us to be at a certain station in Amsterdam, not the central station, another station. And they put all the Jews that they could find. It was the last transport to Westerbork. So from Westerbork, all this time, they were transporting the prisoners, the Jewish people, to all the other camps. Not all to Auschwitz, but to Theresienstadt, Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, wherever. There were 4,000 camps in Germany, but we don't know them all. And anyway, so this is the last transport, and we're back in Westerbork with the Speer, but at this point it wasn't doing us much good. And remember, I told you that my mother's family, her siblings, were all born in London. And the sister born after my mother, the 2 years younger, had her British passport with her, and it was valid rather, to 1945. But it had no value to travel anywhere because all the borders were closed. But she took the passport with her and hid it in her underwear so that nobody could steal it or take it from her when she was arrested, she and her husband. And when we were in Westerbork, somehow or other, she got to hear that there's a woman who comes to Westerbork every so often, a Gestapo woman. There were Gestapo women as well as men, and that she could talk to her. So my aunt got an appointment with her and told her that she was from England. And this woman says, "Oh, well, then you don't go east, you go to France, to Vitel, France." We'd never heard of it. Nobody had ever heard of it anyway. But my aunt said, "Well, what about my husband?" "No, your husband is a Jew. He's going somewhere else." So then my aunt explained to her, which was not true, that her husband was stateless and that he was German, that he was Jewish, but stateless. And she says, "Okay, then let him go too." And then she came to all the barracks that we were in, and my grandparents were in all the different barracks and told us about it. So my mother went to this Frau Schlottke and so on. And we all, I don't know, to this day, I still not don't know how my grandparents, who had only lived in England and never were born in Amsterdam, and my father, who was totally Dutch, and the other uncles, how we all got to go to Vittel. But I always say whoever survived this Holocaust was lucky. Luckier, it's better to be lucky than to be smart. You might not agree with me, but that's how it is. So we were sent on the train to Vittel, France, which is a spa town in France. The Germans took it over because it had hotels. And the people who were in Vittel were not only Jewish people, also Christian, non-Jewish people, but it was all people who were born either in Britain, North America, or South America. And now we became prisoners of war because they were sure they were gonna win the war, and we were gonna be exchanged for the Germans that the Allies had in their in the prisoner of war camps. And so we didn't have to wear our Jewish stars. And we got a little bit better food, and that's where we were. We were still prisoners of the Germans. We were surrounded by barbed wire, had no education, nothing. And again in September, everything happened in September of 44. We were liberated by the most wonderful army in the world, the United States Army. And they liberated us, which was fabulous, but you're liberated from being guarded, being threatened by the Germans, but you don't have anything else. You have no clothing, no money, you have nothing. You really are nothing, because that's what the Germans want to do to us, make us seem like we were nothings, and no pride or whatever. And so the Americans took over the Tampa Vittel for whatever reason, and they sent us to another town in Germany, my family, called La Bourboule. La Bourboule was also a spa, so they had hotels there too. And now we are displaced persons. And we couldn't go back to Holland until June of 45, because Holland was not liberated until May of 45. And then we got permission to get on a bombed out train for 3 days with no food and no sleep, no anything, no any, and they took us back to Amsterdam, where the Dutch government was waiting at the station with a lariat for us to wear that said homeless. and they gave each person 10 guilders, and then they put us up into like the orphanages where they had already killed all the orphans. And we stayed there till we got assigned apartments. Well, my grandparents were back in their house because the buildings were not bombed. My parents and I, got an apartment that was owned by a Nazi, but he was put in jail by the Dutch government. And he left out a lot of German Nazi paraphernalia. But by then, my father had heard through the Red Cross that his entire family, everybody, had been murdered. He was the only one on the Waterman's side, he and I, that returned. So my father naturally did not want to see all this Nazi paraphernalia, and he destroyed it all. And the Dutch people, when they saw my father or my grandfather, somebody walk down the street, some of them were so mean, they would say, "Oh, they only killed the good Jews," or they knew my father was a twin. They'd say, "Oh, they killed the good twin." People were dreadful. Not all of them, but enough to make you feel horrible. As a child, I had learned to read when I was 4 years old, but I had no education. So when I came back to Holland, I was 9 years old. I had the same capacity as a 4-year-old. I didn't have math or anything. So the Dutch government opened up a school for children who returned and had no education. Of course, not that many kids returned, but they put a school together, and we got to learn what we had to learn, and we worked very, very hard. And then when we had enough knowledge, we were sent to regular grammar schools. And then I went to a high school, a very good high school. And my parents and family were able to restart their lives a little bit. And finally, they got merchandise. It's like something like, not the same, but you can make it seem like it's COVID, after a while, things start taking on a normal face again. So that being said, my mother's sisters had no children. I was the only grandchild for 14 years in my mother's family. And my mother's two sisters and their husbands decided in 1947 to leave for the United States. They didn't want to be in Holland anymore. The husbands had lost all their families. My aunt had lost her first husband after she was married 6 months. He was killed in Mauthausen. So they had absolutely no desire to stay in the Netherlands. And they got permission to move to the United States. And in 1950, the Russians and the Koreans were making war sounds and they called my mother and said, "How can you stay in Holland? There's going to be another world war, and you have a child, and it's irresponsible. You shouldn't be there." And so my grandparents and my mother, father, and I applied for a visa and for sponsors, and you had to go through health checkups and everything in order to get a visa to come to the United States. So they had to sell those businesses, which they got very little money for because, when you have to sell something, you never get true value. Anyway, the five of us got on a boat and left for the United States in April of 51. And we landed in Hoboken, New Jersey, which I understand now is a beautiful place. Then it was not. It was dirty and noisy, and it was when we got off the boat, I got so hysterical. I said, "I don't want to stay here. I can't speak. I don't understand what they're saying, and it's so dirty and noisy, and I want to go back to Holland." And my mother said, "No way." And So we stayed in New York nearby for a few days, and then my aunt from Chicago came and took us on the train to Chicago because my aunts had settled in Chicago. And my aunts had rented they didn't have much money either, but they were working and then they opened up a business and they made sure that they had a house that would accommodate all of us for the time being, and which we did. And then they signed me up in a school in Chicago. And then my nightmare started again because in those days, we landed on April 25th. I was 14 years old. On April 26th, I was 15 years old. It was one of the worst birthdays. But anyway, so in those days, American schools were not integrated with people so much from different countries or different backgrounds. So when I went to school, the kids kind of looked at me like I was strange and they didn't help me find my way. They did nothing nice. And it was very sad because I cried every night, but my family loved me so much that they helped me through it. And eventually I learned to speak English, as you can tell. And and I got used to it, and it made me strong, as miserable as I was. And then when we got our report cards to graduate, it was customary in Chicago to go to the Indiana Dunes, which is a beach. And a girl had befriended me, and she said, "Why don't you come with?" I said, "No," but I did anyway. And there was a young man there who kept looking at me, and then he eventually came over and asked if I wanted to go for ice cream. And I said, okay. And he took my telephone number and he called me and we started to date. And we got married in 1955. We were married for 62 years. Unfortunately, he's no more with me because he passed away. And we worked very hard, both of us. We just worked hard, and I had three children, a son and two daughters. And it's funny to say because we lived on the south side of Chicago, and my son, when he got to go to seventh grade to the middle school, I was told that there was very few Jewish population in the area where I lived, that the boys would beat up on the Jewish boys. And my son was not a fighter. So I said, I went through all this before. Let's get out of here and move somewhere else. So we moved to the northern suburbs of Chicago, and that's was better for my kids and for us. And I raised my children, and then I started a party planning business for bar mitzvahs and weddings for everybody, and worked that for 43 years. And my children got married. I have six wonderful grandchildren and five great grandchildren. So I'm one of the lucky ones because other people my age and younger, there were 1.5 million children murdered during the Holocaust, 6 million about altogether. Why was I not killed? Why were we not killed? I don't know. I have to live with that guilt that my cousins and other people did not make it. And also, I have trouble, for me, Yom HaShoah is not one day a year. I have Yom HaShoah. I think about my camp time all the time. So for me, it's all year long. But to think that they killed all the people and that there was such hatred is so very hard, even though I'm old enough to have a solution, but I don't, that they hated us so much because there was no reason to hate us. We've never started a war. We've done a lot for the world, had a lot of good inventions. Not all Jews are perfect, I understand, but neither are all non Jews perfect. So why do you have to hate us? how could they ever get in their minds the atrocities that they did to people, to think of gas chambers, to it's inconceivable to me that anybody could hate. I'm not a very good person. I mean, I'm not a bad person, but I mean, I don't hate anybody. I don't care if you're black, white, yellow, purple, if you're Christian. If you're a good soul, you're my friend, you know? So I don't understand it. And I also think that eventually the same thing in a different fashion will happen again because look at the anti-Semitism that's happening today. And it's very frightening. But I like to tell people that the hating is a useless personal part of your personality because it doesn't make you feel happier. It just, hate is doesn't make you feel good. Doesn't make anybody feel good. So why hate? Why not tolerate and live with other people and like other people and get to know other people other than your tight circle and make the world a better place? I think living with love is a lot better than living with hate. And that is my story.
All right, Ms. Glass, thank you so much for sharing with us today that powerful testimony. I'm inviting if we have just a few moments for questions for Ms. Glass.
Oh,
I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Professor Amanda Carwell-Coxon. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat, and Professor Carwell-Coxon will read them to Ms. Glass.
I want to reiterate the thank you. Your story was very powerful, and I think we have a lot to learn from it. I'm just waiting on questions to come in.
well, you know, it's hard to ask questions, but you know what? We keep telling the story, and we're the last you're the last generations that will meet life survivors because we're all
Yeah,
elderly to say the least. Um, the Holocaust survivors are hard to find nowadays, and
yeah,
I don't know how I've spoken since 1988, and the reason I started to speak because we never really talk about the Holocaust in my family spoke about it, my aunts and uncles and my everybody amongst ourselves, but we didn't speak about it outside of the house until the Skokie Holocaust Museum was built, and I was the old one, and I was asked to speak, and then I said no, and then I said yes, and I've been speaking ever since. But I wonder if I ever reach anybody who has hatred and dislike for Jewish people. I wonder if I could change their minds because we do a lot of good for this world. Your medicines, your technology, your art, I mean, they're very talented, a lot of talented people. I happen to not be one of them, but, you know, so I don't understand why people have to hate. And I've
yeah.
never gotten a good answer.
That's such a powerful question that I don't think anybody has an answer for. And if we could figure it out, we'd all make billions of dollars, right?
Well, this, and then we could change ourselves
We
and
could change the world
change the
yeah.
world, yes.
So I do have a few questions coming through our Q&A. One of our participants our participants would wonder if you still speak your first language.
Fluently. I,
There.
I, well, now I'm not well, but until last year, I went to Holland every summer.
That was going to be my follow-up question. If you're
Yes,
able to go back,
yes,
that
yes, yes.
if that is
Even though, you know, people weren't always nice to us, but now they are. And a lot of the Dutch people don't know what happened, the younger people.
right, right. Um, Is this is a really good question. Is there something that you wish people would ask you, that you would like people to know about you?
Well, what you know about me, I always say Hitler did not take my life, but he took my youth. I didn't have a youth like my children had or my grandchildren, with sleepovers and movies and stuff. I had none of that because I studied so hard to catch up, with education. And then when I came to America, I had to do it all over again. And it was, coming to America was great in retrospect, but it was very difficult to be discriminated against because I was not an American. And I want people, like when somebody new comes to your school or to your line of work or whatever, be welcoming, be nice to them, see if you can help them. I mean, you don't have to become their besties, but just be kind and see if they need some help. Do they know where this room is or that place is, or you know kindness goes a long way, and you might be surprised. But and not and I think young people should not hate that much that they want to kill people. I mean, it goes on every day. I mean, there's these simpletons that shoot in the schools and stuff. It's horrible.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
horrible. Because
Absolutely.
I'm anti-guns,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it never stops. And when they signed the peace treaty from World War II, there were already stuff going on in other countries, genocides, before the ink was dry on the paper. I mean, I can't change the world, but I would like to at least maybe get through to one person who would say, you know what, you're right, we shouldn't hate. That I would love that.
Well, and I think that work from you and survivors that have done work with Tennessee Holocaust Commission and commissions across the U.S. are doing that hard work, and hopefully you are reaching people. Um,
I'm not sure, but I try.
I hope so. Yes. As a history professor, I must feel it in my heart that
That's right.
that
Right.
these
So you
accounts
teach
help.
your student, you teach the Holocaust.
Oh yes, today. So yes, it was in the agenda today.
Well, is it a must in Tennessee? Is it required? In
Well,
Illinois, where
at
I used
higher ed
to.
levels, we definitely cover it, but I believe it is part of the Tennessee. Yeah,
Yeah, in
Allison
Illinois
is
it is.
shaking her head. Yes, in K-12, that they're required to teach it. There's somebody in chat who commented, this is more of a comment than a question, but that their father-in-law was also at the same camp that you were in, and
Really?
survived, came to the US, got married, and had two sons, and two
And what was
granddaughters.
his name? Does she know?
The person who put in the comment is Marilyn Goldstein. Um,
Oh,
but
she's definitely
that
Jewish. Yes.
that's a father-in-law, so I don't know
Right,
if
right, right,
Marilyn, if you would like to share his name, I will absolutely share it
right. But
with.
it's, yeah, they're very, that in Holland, that one of the reasons I started to speak, that I was, convinced myself that I should speak, is because when people I were speaking about the Holocaust in Chicago, in Skokie, they all were from Poland and Germany and from the eastern part of Europe. And nobody ever realized, first of all, people didn't know where Holland was or what it is. And they had never heard the story of the Dutch Jews. There were 140. Wait a minute, I have to sneeze. Excuse me. There were 140 Dutch Jews in 1940,
Wow.
and 102,000 were murdered. That's the second
Wow.
highest percentage after Poland.
That is, yeah, that's a huge percentage.
And now I mean, I have friends in Holland. I didn't have friends when I left Holland because we were so busy studying and stuff like that. I didn't have time for fun and games. But, and the people in the school, I don't know. But now I have a lot of friends in Holland, and a lot of them are Holocaust survivors. Most.
Wow.
But that being said, if you can hear me, if you're ever in Illinois, in Chicago, right now it's under construction, under remodeling. The Skokie, Illinois Holocaust Museum in Skokie, Illinois is so worth going to. It is, I know everybody knows about Yad Vashem, but this one is different and it's very, very informative. You would learn a lot and it's really nice. And I made a virtual reality film that plays there. That's, with the headset. And I
Wow.
also made a hologram. The
Wow, that's
virtual
really neat.
reality I like because it was shot in the Netherlands. I was there, and you see where I lived and where the camp was, and
Mhm.
it tells a story, but it's very move. People, it's in 360, so it looks so real. And if you
Wow.
ever go there, it's worth. Now they're in downtown Chicago for a while, but if you ever go, please, you don't have to watch my movie. You can watch anybody else's. But mine is good.
My
But
family's from Illinois, so I'll have to
what?
take a special trip.
Are
Um,
in Illinois?
yeah, I'm from Central, not from Skokie, but
Okay.
so the man's name who survived was named Alfred Goldstein.
Oh, he's a Goldstein. Okay.
Um, another question in the chat, and kind of a big question. What do you think kept your family going? The financial hardships, the terror that you were under daily. Um, what what kept you keeping one foot in front of
Maybe
the
during
other?
the war? During the war.
During.
Huh? Yeah. Well, I think that I come from a very strong-minded family on my mother's side. Of course, my father's side didn't have a chance. I was lucky that my grandfather made that good decision about his money, even though it wasn't legal for the Germans. And that chance had it that my mother was born in England. I mean, that's just a lucky accident. And I think what kept them going during the war was always the hope that you're going to survive, that you're going to go back home, that life would be normal or whatever normal is, would be good again. And, being more optimistic, and you have to be strong. And I think any survivor you talk to, if you get their story, it always involves luck. Luck. My grandfather told me after the war that there were other people who had money who could have done the same thing with the Speer, but they didn't trust the guy. So you have to sometimes gamble a little bit.
And I'm sure there were plenty that just took advantage. And so you wouldn't know who to trust.
No, but they
100%.
didn't have the money to do it.
Well, yes, absolutely.
But there
Um,
were people that could have done it.
sure. There's a lot of well wishes and a lot of thank yous.
Thank you very much. I
It,
hope. Have
there
a
are
great
also a
night.
few
Yeah.
people that are just asking. I'm sorry, I don't mean to
Go ahead. Go ahead.
talk. There are also a few people that are just asking, kind of in general, what do you think is good advice to prevent something like this from happening again, particularly
Oh,
in
you heard it
current
before,
political?
not to hate.
Yeah,
It was hate. And the Jews have been persecuted for millennia. I mean, as I told you, we were chased out of Portugal and Spain. We were chased out of Egypt. We just had our Passover, we were chased, people somehow hate Jews, and I don't know why. Again, I go back to the same question, why? you know. And some people have made remarks to me, not knowing, well, I wear my Star of David all the time because people say, aren't you afraid? And I say, no. At one time I had to wear it under, you know, I could have gotten killed if I didn't. I says, and now I wear it because I want to, and I'm not afraid to wear it. But um, I have, as I said, I'm an optimist, but I still think that it's going to happen again somehow or other, the hatred. And some people hate Jews and have never met one. This is I cannot understand at all.
Mm.
You know, have you ever met a Jew? No, but my mother said I should hate him. Well, then I hate him, right? Well, think for yourself and don't listen to everything that people say. You know, you can think about it and analyze it and see if it's right for you or if it's right for the world. Is it right for your children and grandchildren?
Yeah.
And
Uh,
don't hate, please. I mean, you don't have to love everybody, but hate, I don't even know how it feels to hate.
right.
I have a good friend in Germany, a young man who does beautiful volunteer work, for comes to Chicago and worked for the museum, and I met him. And he's, I mean, so I can't say I hate Germans because I don't hate him at all. I love him.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really strong point.
You know, this, and there, you know what, and there are a lot of good people in the world, but the bad ones get all the publicity
Of course. Yes.
because it doesn't sell, as they say, good news doesn't sell newspapers.
Um, Sorry, I'm trying to group some
Um,
questions together.
and Amanda, while you look, I have one that I would like to ask you, Rhodey, that is one that's important for me to have you address. And our current, just there's so much, as you say, hatred in the world. How do you respond when you hear or hear through firsthand or through the news that someone's saying that the Holocaust has never happened? The denial, the distortion. How do you even navigate that?
Well, sometimes when I talk and I mention that, and I say, how can people say that it never happened when there's actual documentation of, there's leftover camps, but there's papers. I have documents that we had, but there are papers that movies, films that the Germans took, that are at Yad Vashem and at the at the U.S. Holocaust. There's documentation. So how can you say it didn't happen? I think it's people who are unfortunately ignorant and just talk foolishness. It's like saying there's no cure for polio, I mean there is, but there are people, and I think they don't know that they're denying it because there's so much proof that it happened. And there's us talking about it that it happened. So if they want to think it didn't happen, just be ignorant, but don't talk about it so much because you really don't make sense. It's not a smart move.
Right. And I think it's important to also say, and just from my perspective, look at the fact that Germany is saying we did this. Like
Yes.
look at the
And
Germans'
what about the
response.
American soldiers or the English, all the Allied troops that lost people and that they knew it was happening and so saying it didn't happen, I think it's looking for 5 minutes of fame or 5 seconds of fame.
Yeah.
But saying, oh, that didn't happen, but well, darn well it happened. It's just to make a name for yourself. Yeah, that's what I think. Because I could never say that anything didn't happen when you have total proof that it did. One 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 night years ago, I had a sleepless night, and my husband was sleeping, and I went to the computer, and I thought, okay, what should I Google? So I thought, okay, let me Google what American Army liberated us in Vital. And as I went on it, up came a film that the Americans took. The Americans filmed the liberation of Vital, and I happen to be in it. My aunt and uncle are in it, my parents. I mean, I almost had a heart attack. I didn't know this film existed, but it's belonged to the US Holocaust, and I have a disc of it. But so how can you deny stuff when there's so much evidence and so much that you could look at? You can see me on, and a lot of other people on YouTube as well. I do other programs besides speaking. They have wonderful programs, names, not numbers, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But for a while it wasn't popular to talk about Holocaust, you know,
I
and
think that's something
then
that
it came here.
modern students, we have a few younger students in the chat too, but I think that's something that modern audiences don't understand is that for a period of time, people didn't talk about it, and kind of tried to live your life. It wasn't really until like the 1960s, 1970s that we
I
started
think,
seeing,
well, Anne Frank kind of made the soup du jour,
yeah,
though she wasn't Dutch, but she was German, but, you know,
right, right.
and unfortunately she got murdered too. Nobody died during the Holocaust. Everybody was murdered because they were killed at a, they would have had more life if they hadn't died. So
Mhm.
they were murdered, and but when we came to America and we stayed in my aunt's, then we got an apartment for the five of us, my grandparents and us. And in Chicago, they have alleys where you put the garbage cans. So my grandfather walked downstairs with garbage, and a woman said, "Oh, you're new here." He spoke English because he was in business in England. And she says, "Oh, you're new here." He says, "Yeah." She's, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Holland. We're Holocaust survivors," and blah, blah, blah. And she says, "Oh, yes, it was difficult here too. We could not get nylon stockings." So with that, my grandfather comes upstairs and says, "We're not talking about this outside of the house because they don't understand." And there were people living in America that are my age now, that didn't know what was going on because their parents didn't talk about it and they didn't see the news. It was different. There was no social media. But I do say if there would have been a state of Israel at that time, this Holocaust would not have happened. We had no presence. We had no, uh, you know, uh, you know, it would have been totally different. And
I mentioned a few of our younger audience members, and we do have an 8-year-old who is curious. And if you witnessed acts of violence yourself, and then how in your adulthood, well, childhood and adulthood, because you were just a baby when this was happening, how have you processed this um,
well,
to be
so
able to
I
function
don't
as
want
an
to get
adult?
into politics because that's not right. That's not. But when I see the ICE people arresting innocent people, or mostly innocent people, and dragging them, I get physically sick because that reminds me of what we went through.
Mhm.
It's somewhat like that.
Yeah.
People haven't learned.
There are several people in the chat making those connections, and so I'm glad you also did. Um, Really easy question here. Was your husband also Jewish? You met him in the States. With
Yes, he was. He was a first generation. His parents were born in Russia and Poland.
Oh,
But he was used, but believe it or not, he never spoke Dutch, but he could understand it because my family always spoke Dutch when they were together, on Sunday dinners and stuff.
mhm.
So he got it. My kids don't speak Dutch, but unfortunately, but he and I spoke English together.
Right.
Yeah,
Hindsight, right? When when they're older and you're like, man, we should have
right.
did that when their brains were small and able to take on languages. Um, let's see. How did it feel when the US military showed up to liberate the camps? How did you
Well, it was. like, amazing. It is mildly saying it mildly because they had first the French resistance called the Maquis tried to liberate us. And my aunt tells the story that she used to see outside the barbed wire for several days an old man was walking back and forth. And she, because outside of the camp was free territory for the French people. And finally, when the French resistance tried to free us, she realized that this old man was not an old man. He was a young person in the resistance, made to look like an old man. And he was kind of checking out how to do this. But they weren't strong enough until the Americans came and they electrified the barbed wire so we couldn't get out, made sure of that. The Germans, after the resistance tried and failed. But then the Americans came and they didn't have a chance. So, and it was, I mean, they were like a sight for sore eyes, I mean, it was amazing. And one of the soldiers, I was standing with my mother, and he looked down and he said, "Oh," he says, "isn't that a cute little girl you have? I have a little girl like that at home too." And he gets up and he got out fruit and gum. We didn't have any of that. I didn't even know what to do with the gum. They were so kind, and they were nice guys. But
Yeah.
that being said, wars are terrible because good people get killed. Bad people, how bad are they get killed? There's no good war, and there's never a winner. Every war, everybody's losing. You lose. I mean, a lot of mothers lost their sons and their husbands and to fight the war. I mean, in any war. I hate war, but people. I know. And I always say, if maybe if women ran the world, they would get together and say, "All right, so here, I'll make you a cup of coffee. Here's my best cake that I just made. Have a piece of cake and we'll talk about it. So how are your children? Oh, good. How many grandchildren you have about? All right, so we shouldn't keep going with this silly war, right? No, we shouldn't. Okay, now we have peace. But men, the testosterone, it never stops.
Agreed. No. So and I can kind of leave it with this. There are a few other questions in here, but I'm kind of synthesizing them. There's a lot of questions about like what motivated you to start telling your story. How did you feel when you started telling your story? Were you afraid of blowback or criticism? So kind of a bunch of big questions there.
I started to talk, as I said, because people, there were speakers in Skokie in the old building. We now have a nice building, but the old building, but they always talked about Eastern Europe and so on. And then I decided it was time that the people should hear about the Dutch Jews because they didn't even know there were such things. And in those days, the people, I started to talk in 1988 or something. And people didn't know that there was a Holland, that there was a Holocaust in Holland. So I figured, I somebody convinced me that I should talk about it. So I got persuaded, and it was hard. It's always hard. It sounds like I'm talk very easy, but it's very painful. It's very hurtful to think of all the people and all the talent that was murdered.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine people using babies as targets for like skeet shooting? That's what they did. I mean, how cruel can you be? You know,
Exactly.
I
Um, again. we all want to thank you for your time, for your story. There are so many people that are just saying in the Q&A, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Right, if you want to give, if anybody wants to talk to me, you can give them my email address. And
We absolutely will. Thank you.
very
Um,
nice meeting you. And
and
where
thank
are
you
you
so
in
much for your
Tennessee?
time.
Are you in Nashville?
No, I am in Maryville, in my office. We're kind of, most of
Maryville,
us are in the
Tennessee.
east. Maryville, Tennessee. Yeah, so close to Knoxville. I suppose you probably don't know little old Maryville, do you? Close to Knoxville, Tennessee, about 3 hours from Nashville.
Nice. A friend.
And then I'm in Knoxville, and John Brown's pretty close to me as well. So we're all sort of on the eastern part of the state.
Okay, good. All right. Well, you
We've
do
got
a
participants
good
from
job.
all over the state,
Your
though.
students
So,
are very lucky to have you as their teachers.
well, thank you.
It is.
Let's tell
I,
them again, louder, for the ones that are listening, that they're very lucky to have me and
They
Professor Brown.
They, I would agree with that. I have traveled with John Brown to Poland recently. We were just at Auschwitz and Treblinka together, and Amanda and I have been friends for 10 years, and I know her very well and know the kind of quality of work that they both do. So, everybody, you are both extraordinary teachers, and your students are lucky to have you. Rodi, thank you so
well, I
very
thank
much.
you. It was nice meeting you. I hope I did well for you. I hope,
It
you know,
was fantastic. It was a real privilege and a pleasure. So,
thank
thank
you.
you so
Thank
much. We
you
will
so
make
much.
the
My
webinar
story
recording
is not
available.
this, yeah. Sometimes people ask me if I ever met Hitler. No, I did not. Another question is, do I ever want to not be Jewish because of what I went through? No, I would not want to be anything but Jewish. So that answers those questions. But
Fantastic.
it was very nice meeting you, and I wish you all the luck in the world. And I know you won't hate. Thank you very much for having
Thank
me.
you so much. And thank you to everybody. Have a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night.